The conversation you're about to hear today on the Media Roundtable is the first time we've released the uncut conversations that became the short series, What's a Podcast? The Revolution Redefined. I'm Dan Granger, CEO of Oxford Road and Baritone One and host of the Media Roundtable podcast. We're giving you the full length version of specific conversations we had with about 30 of the leaders of podcasting today. That includes creators like Ira Glass, Guy Raz, so many others, as well as leading publishers, advertisers, and thought leaders, where we tried to sit around the table and debate what is a podcast? Why does it matter? Why'd you get into this to begin with? And what do we need to do to preserve that into the future as we build a bigger definition of what podcasting actually is? Some of these conversations are a snapshot of a very specific moment in time, but they're all durable and timeless in the importance of the conversation. I learned a lot. For me, this whole project was a love letter to podcasting and something that is able to blend real business value with the passion that brought me and so many others into this field. And I think you're really going to enjoy it. So with that, please enjoy this next installment of the full-length interview series, What's a Podcast? Well, this is it. This one's for all the marbles. We are here at the Media Roundtable doing exactly what this podcast was designed to do and showcasing what a podcast can do, which is really be not just entertainment, but a vehicle for change in the real world. And we've been doing this series. It's been an extensive, lightning speed series where we've compiled about 30 interviews with industry experts exploring the issue of what's a podcast. By the way, I'm Dan Granger, CEO of Oxford Road and Baritone One, and I've had the pleasure of hosting this series where we've gotten every perspective from key players in the field, where some folks come on and they say, we don't need the word podcasting anymore. It has no purpose, or saying, this topic really doesn't matter. Who cares? Call it whatever you want. Let's move on. And then you've got a lot of people that are saying, no, a podcast has to be audio or has to have an RSS. So there's a lot of diverse opinions that we've identified in this conversation about what a podcast is, what it means, what the real implications are for consumers, for people that work in the business, and stakeholders all around the table. So today is the moment of truth, because in concert with this series, we partnered with Edison Research. And we asked them to say, okay, set aside what we all think who work in the business. Let's find out what the customer thinks. Let's find out what the real end user believes about this. And I'm grateful to invite Larry Rosin, who runs Edison Research, back to the program, who is going to share with us the perspective of the voice of the customer from the intense analysis that he has overseen. And we're going to try to hash this thing out. We both have proposed working definitions for the industry. We're going to see if we can agree. We're going to do some disagreement. We're going to try for this not to turn into Parliament, or I guess Congress now. And we're going to keep it real civil. We're going to get a high civility score, but you will hear differing views as we try to debate what is most important in our definition for the future of this industry. So, Larry, welcome back to the Media Roundtable.
Of course. Thanks, Dan. Happy to be here.
You ready for this?
All right. We'll see what happens. Yeah, it should be interesting.
A couple things just to lay the foundation, because we've got a lot of technical discussion to be had here. The core question of what's a podcast, why does it matter in your view? Why is it even a question worth asking?
I think it has changed over time. I think it is evolving. Even if we settle on a definition today, maybe 10 years from now, we'll look back on it and say we didn't anticipate various ways that it continues to evolve, and we wouldn't word it the same in the future. But it is also important that when we or anyone talk about podcasting, that there is some agreed to standard for what a podcast actually is. I think it's important just in the general world, but it's particularly important in the advertising world, where advertisers still, this many years into the podcasting project, are learning about podcasting, learning how to buy it, learning how to understand it, and having them having some amount of agreement on what we're even talking about is pretty crucial to continuing to see this platform develop.
I agree with you. I think there are a lot of financial implications, and it is advertising that fuels the industry that we all love here. So, I happen to have a deeper interest in the advertising aspect, but certainly it is oxygen for so much of the marketplace. And so, agree with that. There's a lot of implications here. You got hundreds of companies that define themselves by the word pod, tens or hundreds of thousands of people that actually identify their careers, like they will call themselves podcasters. That is part of their identity, and that's just a piece of it. The confusion in the market, when an advertiser doesn't know what they're budgeting for, does have material consequences. And as the ecosystem changes, as the definition shifts below our feet, there are new challenges we're running into, specifically around measurement, that are making it less appetizing. Even as the hype is up, the measurement is actually moving backwards. The ability for an advertiser to know what they're buying, what the value was, and how that performed for their business. We're moving backwards in those areas, and these are material threats to the industry. I just want to share a couple other pieces of context as we're going in here. People have always hated the word podcast. I'm not sure I would have picked it, but there has been something durable about it. And one of the common reasons people tried to kill it, 10 years ago, which was a feasible argument, is to say, look, it was called that because you listen to it on an iPod. Now nobody has an iPod. We all have smartphones, right? It's dead. It's an obsolete piece of technology. Why are we anchoring something around obsolete tech? And still, people continue to use the word podcasts. And now that some of the big players, not just Apple and Spotify, but now Google through YouTube, have really leaned in on this term, I contend that the argument is a settled issue. The pod stays in the picture, whether you like it or not, whether or not we would have chosen it. It's here and it's with us. Now let's figure out what the hell it means so we can know how we're going to do business here.
Yeah, and I agree with you, by the way. I get everything you said and the point about the origin of the term, but it's gotten to the point where it's irrelevant. It's the term that's been settled upon. It's the term that people use, and we did all these interviews with consumers. It never once came up that the term was somehow problematic.
Interesting. And yet people want it dead. Why do you think people want to move away from it so badly?
I think it's what you said. I think that it's, not the name they would have chosen if they could have, come up with it themselves. Maybe the point you're making about it seeming outdated, but if anyone even takes the time on the consumer end to consider what the word means, they aren't necessarily thinking back to the iPod. They're thinking, well, it's a pod of content, sort of a piece of content that you could call a pod. I know this has been going on forever, is people not liking the word, but it is the word, and there's so much more important issues and topics to talk about than the term that I feel it's at most just a distraction.
Yeah, and I think it can be, and especially if it stays philosophical, but in practical terms, I think we're doing something that's going to help the industry move it forward. And not everybody's going to agree. Not everybody's going to like where we're going with this. I think we've done our part to really accommodate both its origins as well as its current and future state as we can best understand it. Philosophically, fundamentally, we want a broad podcast definition. We want something that encompasses a lot of the newer things and allows for things like video. But before we get into the technical, and I really want to get into the research that you did, I want you to walk us through that. But just while we're kind of stepping back and having the 30,000-foot conversation, Larry, what is it in your view that is the spirit of podcasting? What is that original essence that made it different than other types of media, that made it something that people got so fanatical about and gave it this momentum?
Well, I think if you go to its absolute earliest places, it was the low barriers to entry and the fact that anyone could create a podcast. And it allowed so much content that was typically kept out by gatekeepers in radio in particular. The sports station in town talks almost entirely about the NFL because the NFL is the most agreed upon topic. But that left every other sport and many other teams undiscussed. And all of a sudden, podcasting allows anyone with an interest in a specific sport or a specific team, just as one example, to start talking about their area of passion and interest. Just opened up to this explosive new world where no matter how narrow your interest, you could typically find content that spoke to you in a way that broadcast, definition around the broad, often just couldn't do. Then, of course, there was sort of the second wave brought upon by Serial, and it being an outcropping of the narrative driven, highly sculpted work that's typically done on public radio in the United States and in other countries by their public service broadcasters. And that sort of expanded the definition for many people of what a podcast could possibly be. So I think if you're talking the first, say, 12 to 13 years of the existence of this medium, that's sort of how it evolved.
I guess to double down on that, what do you think makes podcasting different than every other open ecosystem where you can just post your videos? TikTok, YouTube creator stuff. What's the difference?
Well, certainly until somewhat recently, it was that magic of audio, right? For most people, they were listening on earbuds or headphones in many cases, and so the information was coming directly into their ears, often in an extremely intimate sort of environment. I think in many ways made hundreds of millions of people aware in a way they hadn't been before of how powerful spoken word audio can be. If all they knew from the radio was like zany morning shows and right wing political talk and sports talk, which was the pretty much what was available in spoken word form on the radio. Now, keeping out the sort of NPR world as well, all of a sudden they discovered that it could be utterly magical. So the uniting factor, I think, was audio, and audio a creating that excitement I'm talking about, but also the availability. All of a sudden, they could consume content while on public transport, walking around, certainly driving, while folding their laundry, and in any kind of situation. It opened up all these new avenues for consumption.
It's so interesting, and I think this is one of the things we've been trying to get at in this exercise is like, what are we actually trying to protect here? And I think you've said a lot about the openness of it, and so I just want to restate kind of two key principles that I'm hearing from you and that I've observed over this process. One is just this idea of, you said low barrier to entry, and I just think it's such an American idea, this democratization of voices, this fact that now there is actually representation of interests that were underserved for so long. Whatever you use football, there's literally a million different topics and sub genres and categories that never had a place to gather and to form communities around different ideas. And just that the freedom of it, it's dangerous. I think we've seen a lot of voices come in that, are concerning to many of us for different reasons. And yet I also think, like, if you believe in the American experiment, if you believe that the idea is worth it, we have a lot of liberty. And sometimes there's harm that comes from giving away that much liberty. The net opportunity for everybody to be able to have the ability to share their voice and create a new public square really is high value. And I think a big part of what ushered in the Renaissance. And then the second thing that we just talked about is like, all right, well, why is this not like the others? Because it's certainly not the only platform that consumers can go post on. But I think there is something about what you said, it being intimate because it is audio driven. And especially as you put your AirPods, earpods, whatever, your headphones, a lot of times they're going into your body in a way that you experience it in ways that you just don't do with other forms of media. And I think that allows for a depth of conversation. It's very easy to get on X or whatever and just start throwing sound bites at people and making short, pithy statements that may or may not make sense, but you can just say what you want and then run out of the room. With podcasting, it kind of makes you go sit in the room with that person and you got to work it out in a different way. There's a forcing function where you have to hear the other person, let them respond to you. You have to make space for different arguments and unpack an idea in a deeper way. And that's why it's so much longer than a typical open platform in terms of the size of the content and the time it takes to consume it, that it really allowed for new ways of understanding ideas and stretching them. And it's the reason that I commonly say, podcasting is the greatest canvas in media for the free and open exchange of ideas. So I really believe in it, and I know you do too. I know we've both been pushing for this thing for a long time, and now we're just trying to protect that thing that we love so much. Wherever the final language shakes out, it's been a great exercise and a great journey, and I'm grateful, Larry, for you and the team at Edison for joining us to try to get to the bottom of this thing in a way that's constructive and allows the industry to continue to thrive.
We're glad to have done it. It's been a fascinating project.
Let's get into the findings. First things first, we're doing a few things. Obviously, we have this series that over time we're going to release to the market, and in a synthesized way, we're going to debut it alongside the white paper. And the white paper is really anchored around the research that Edison has done, not just with experts that we've been doing on this show, but with consumers. So, can you talk a little bit about how you went about conducting the study and maybe take us through some of the key findings?
Sure. So we did 2 layers of research. We did what we in the research game would call both quantitative and qualitative research. So we asked some questions in a very large nationally representative survey that tried to drill down on the definition of podcasting at the consumer level. And at the same time, we interviewed consumers of a variety of stripes using Zoom calls, not unlike the one we're on right now, where we talk to people about the term and about what it means to them, and very importantly, what isn't a podcast as well. What are the boundaries of what someone considers a podcast? And we talk to people who are deep, heavy podcast listeners, and we talk to people who just know the term but don't consume on any kind of regular basis and everything in between. And so when you put together the industry experts that you interviewed on Media Roundtable, the qualitative research, which are long discussions with people generating a lot of information, and then these survey questions, you have a ton to work with. And that's been our challenge, is to try to synthesize what are the common themes, what do people agree about, where are the areas where there's less agreement, and all the way to the other end, where do people agree that's no longer a podcast, that can't be considered a podcast. And so that's essentially what we did. And we absolutely found things that were consistent. There were definitely areas where the industry experts are defining it perhaps on the more technical level than consumers. And so we can talk about some of those differences as well. But that's essentially the exercise that we've done.
Well, maybe just to go in reverse order here, the last piece of what you listed before the experts was what's not a podcast? Where does it end? Because I think, we're going to get into where does it begin, but the question about what is the container, and many people say there should be no container. I believe that there should, and elastic on both sides, but with some general guidelines and boundaries. From the research you did with consumers, what did you find is not a podcast?
Well, there were lots of things. I mean, the things you would expect people to understand is not a podcast, they absolutely do. So, if you take, for example, music, which is typically audio and its function, it shares audio with podcasting, but people 100% and completely understand that there's a difference between music and podcasting. So that would be one example. We talked about just straight up television shows that are on cable or over the air television. There was no confusion there. Only when we started to get closer and closer to the world of podcasting was we started to get some people arguing that things were podcasts. So as an example, we threw out do it yourself advisory sort of videos on YouTube. And to be clear, an overwhelming majority of consumers do not think that is a podcast. But you start to see some people saying, yes, that is a podcast. So there are, small numbers, minorities of people who, once you sort of get into the YouTube world, and especially YouTube that's not music, YouTube's content that is spoken word driven, you start to get a small number of people considering such content a podcast. But by the time you get to anywhere close to majority, it does focus down rather quickly on what I think most people in the podcasting industry would also agree is a podcast. Obviously, shows that are only available on audio that talk about different topics, as we've been discussing already on this call. A podcast that is available on YouTube, absolutely count it as a podcast. The next sort of point where it got fuzzier was if content was only available on YouTube and not available as an audio file. And I will tell you that most people still consider that a podcast. And so that's where I think a lot of industry experts would kind of disagree with what consumers think. But think about it, there's now a podcast tab on YouTube. Many people will call their content a podcast, whether or not it's available on the audio only function, say through an RSS feed. So there was sort of this ever narrowing world of agreement on the definition from consumers.
So it sounds like, just to play it back to you, a couple of the key findings here are: one, if it's an audio file, and I don't know if you use the term on demand, but let's say if it's an on demand audio file, consumers generally say that's a podcast.
Yes, I should have mentioned that part, but yes,
The on
whenever we
demand
mention
piece
things that
pairing with
were
audio.
anytime we mention things that were like on the radio and only available at the time they were on the radio, that was clearly understood not to be a podcast. The on demand part was central to everyone's understanding.
All right. So whatever format, anything, video, audio, it's on demand.
Yeah.
And you saw that clearly when you said audio on demand, it was a podcast. But then when you said it's YouTube exclusively, forget the RSS, forget audio only, most people also think that's a podcast.
If it meets the other parameters of a podcast, discussions
Mhm.
and conversations and things that sort of sound like a podcast just happen to also have attendant video.
And so what else stood out to you about the video piece? Because I think we all know that's one of the biggest issues here.
Yeah, so no one will be surprised that not a single consumer is saying, "Oh, there's no RSS feed, it's not a podcast." That's a level of detailed understanding of technology that's invisible to consumers. And so despite podcasting's roots in RSS and its RSS sort of being so central to its history, from the consumer perspective, they're not really thinking about that. It's almost like, what is a car? Was a car is something that gets you from A to B. The definition isn't gasoline or electric. It's the car that gets you from here to there. Then you can have a discussion: is an electric car a car, or is a gas powered car a car? And people maybe could start arguing at that point. The typical agreement point was related to the kinds of content that is even in the video realm, far more than the fact that there's video.
And on that note, I think the car's a good metaphor here. The consumer doesn't necessarily understand all of the engineering specs, but they know what it does for them. Is there something in the shift from an RSS driven platform or an RSS driven channel to being video based without RSS? Is there something that changes in real life that maybe the consumer doesn't realize they lose when it goes off of the decentralized distribution?
People would not volunteer that in our interviews, so it didn't really come up. We did ask, though, about things you have to pay for, and there wasn't full agreement on that. Some people, I think, from the technical perspective correctly, said even if you have to pay to access the podcast, it's still a podcast because the form is a podcast. We did get into some of that, but the sort of available here but not there just really was not
It's
central
not
to
on
the
their
discussion.
minds. It's not on their
Yeah.
minds. So they don't expect that what they see on YouTube, they can pick up on another platform through audio.
Oh, no, in many cases, they know it's available in both in both places. And we definitely had people tell us, "Oh, I learned about a podcast on YouTube, but then I started listening to it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or some such."
Well, I think that's interesting because as the RSS is in decline, does the consumer actually find out later on that they're losing that multi point of distribution opportunity as it starts getting walled off behind platforms that are exclusive or don't provide the same level of openness?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a strategic standpoint, anyone who's interested in getting their content consumed as widely as possible, those examples we said from before where it's only available on Spotify video or on YouTube, I, of course, would encourage them also to make it available as an RSS feed, unless there was some, real business reason not to do so. Why would you not also make it available to people in another format?
Good question. Well, and the less RSS matters, I think the reason becomes it's out of the way, it's not expected, it gets deprioritized, right? Like, why bother with the ancillary? If it falls below 20% of consumption, then why not just, keep your focus on the video platforms exclusively, right?
And we have researched this, not so much in this project, but we have researched the people who say that YouTube is the primary way that they're consuming podcasts. They are overwhelmingly, I mean, they might say that it's on the TV in their living room and it's a little bit backgrounded or things of that nature, but they are typically in a position where they could look at it. There's very little evidence, at least to date, of people using YouTube in the exact same manner that they might have used Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any typical podcast player, where it's purely an audio function and they're almost just ignoring the existence of the video. So it is qualitatively different in most cases when people are using YouTube.
Hmm. Did anything surprise you in the research?
I would say plenty of things. It's why you do the research. I think if I had written the definition of podcasting before this, I would have included any number of things that especially consumers just didn't mention. I will tell you that, and I mentioned this on a previous episode of the Media Roundtable, that the definition for consumers has rapidly evolved sort of away from the highly edited, highly sculpted little, masterpieces for your ears to being defined very heavily as conversations or discussions or interviews. I do have concern about that, as I've expressed before. I'm concerned about the economics of the highly edited kind of content, and I think it's limiting if all podcasting means to people is discussions, interviews, etc.
Well, and do you think the consumer's view is changing toward the highly produced and
No, the
they're
opposite, changed away
okay.
from that, and most people see it as a medium for, I would say, the equivalent of what talk radio or sports talk radio was, without maybe the calls, just two people talking to each other and discussing things, sometimes one person doing so, but the free form, unscripted, open discussion of things.
Okay, so before we get to the definitions on the table, I also want to hear, you have some visibility into the interviews that we did with experts. What are the key differences between what experts think and what consumers think?
Well, I mentioned already, I think, it's typically a more technical kind of understanding. I mean, the letters RSS never once came up among consumers, and yet regularly comes up when you talk to industry people. There is a clear understanding among most consumers of the sort of audio centricism of podcasting, that it starts with audio. However, I would say that the industry experts see it more so as that. I think the consumers are much more fluid in their feelings about, sure, it could have video, could not have video. It still could be a podcast one way or the other, whereas industry people are a little bit more a little less open-minded, I think, about what the definition of a podcast might be. So I would say those are the two principal ones. What about you? What stuck out to you in terms of the differences?
Well, I think you nailed it earlier in that the consumer's not so concerned with how they get it, and they don't necessarily, care, and why should they, about, the implications. But you've got so many interested parties. which is good, right? Like different stakeholders and making trades, trying to figure out like why do the RSS folks push for RSS so much, and why do the folks that just want to call it a show want to expand it and have no containment around it, right? There's usually an economic incentive that the consumer doesn't really care about at all. They just want what they want when they want it. Like, give me my on demand show where I can go a little deeper, have something that I can kind of geek out on a particular topic, hear voices that I like and hopefully enjoy. But then you've got a bunch of interested people lobbying, basically. It's been a caucus meeting here with folks, I think all of us in some degree jockeying for what we see as the most advantageous for our business, right? And so as we move into the discussion here, I just framing wise for folks that are listening to this conversation, I think we were trying to balance four different groups that are a little bit opposed in their objectives. We have to balance the needs of consumers with the needs for the industry in how we think about defining this. If you only chase what the consumer thinks, you discard a lot of material business consequences that I think are going to make it harder to keep consumers getting what they want and expect. So you have to benefit, what pays for it, the consumer who usually gets it for free, with the people that are making it for free for them and just asking them to pay with their time through advertising. So we had to balance that. The other two constituencies are the kind of centralized folks, which I would say is largely, tech platforms that are having that's kind of the new phenomenon in the business here. It was Apple, and they really didn't care and kind of had a bit of an arm's length relationship with their creation. And then people got interested, Spotify and Google at the top of the list, right? You have to balance where they're taking the industry with the independence, with the spirit of it, which was decentralized. If it's all platform dependent, we don't have an industry. We have whatever a few CEOs decide at the time that they decide it, and then may change their minds. And I think we're trying to build something and fortify it so that there is an opportunity for everyone, that it maintains its spirit of meritocracy, where anybody with an idea can come out and make that available to the world. And I think when we're chasing algorithms, even if deplatforming is not a common issue, the algorithms affect everybody. And when we're all living under the reign of the lords of the algorithm, it takes away from that spirit of independence that I think gave this industry its thrust and continues to give it. And we need to preserve it and protect it. So we're trying to balance all these things.
We started this discussion by talking about how it grew out of, the fact that the gatekeepers really in radio at the time were only able to serve so much of the public. And so, it created a world without gatekeepers. And while the issues you are talking about are incredibly important, to date, they are rather invisible to the consumer. They're not seeing the the very legitimate concerns you express about gatekeepers and what they can do, sort of undoing all that creativity and just explosion of content that removing gatekeepers did. And so I think that, having an eye on that, as you state so smartly there, is just super important if this medium is going to continue to thrive, especially because that's just so deeply part of the sort of DNA of what podcasting certainly has been. And I agree with you. I hope continues to be.
So when we started this show, we were getting really into polarization, right? And I remember we did an interview with the CMO of a company called Braver Angels that was trying to take the venom out of the national debate. And one of the things that I remember him saying on the show during the interview was that, when you've got a million people behind something, you reach a level of critical mass that now you have a movement. Now you can actually change things in the real world. And it's interesting that I was thinking about what you just said, how the consumer really is not very invested and not very interested. But if you consider the fact that there have been like 6 million podcasts, you figure we're over a million different creators. And so there are probably more than a million independent voices that actually need that decentralization, that need to make sure that they still have an ability to post and to share, that actually may be a subset of the consumer that's still large enough to really have kind of a hybrid voice in this discussion because they're still interested in it. That just occurred to me.
And you made a great point earlier about how it's led to this democratization of voices and how that, fits into sort of the American experience. It's not just America. I mean, these are very potent in countries with all forms of government, all forms of freedom of expression. And it's part of the excitement of what digital media of all kinds have really done, as well as a big part of what concerns people who find it threatening when everyone can have a voice.
So, in the next few years, from what we're being told, we'll have robots in our house that can clean, cook, do basic chores for us. We see that AI is already taking a lot of the work that we've been doing and a lot of the things we went to college for and making those things obsolete very quickly. Technology is changing the world. I think we know that. So I have a question. Why are we still using vanity URLs to track ad performance? Why are we using the same technology and approaches that we used 20 years ago when this industry was established to try to get an understanding of how consumers are responding to our commercials? If you're a chief audio officer, this is an everything issue. This is maybe the most important part of what you do. I've been in this business for roughly 20 years. The number one obstacle advertisers face is attribution. It's figuring out how to credit the right media source for the performance that's observable in market. And it's always hard. There's been a lot of development in things like pixel tracking, MMM models, there's incrementality. There's a lot of fancy ways to try to figure out how well your ads are performing. But frankly, they all fall short when you're trying to get a comprehensive look at your campaigns. We talk about this a lot, and so much of the work that we've been talking about when we're trying to define what a podcast even is directly correlated to this issue. Let me be specific. If you buy an ad from a host and they read your ad on their show and it is baked in, and that ad runs on iTunes, where you may have a tracking pixel to tell you the response rate, and then that same ad runs on YouTube, where they have a video podcast, that tracking pixel no longer works. So even though you were doing digital-like measurement, it still didn't tell you the total response from the audience, potentially from one of the most important channels that you can do. And even when you customize to that, think about the fact that on YouTube, you're hoping that a host is going to do an ad that tells people to click a link in a show description, and you're counting on the consumer to follow those instructions. Well, people don't usually follow instructions very well. And that's why a few years ago, we did a case study where we actually measured a new way to track response rates, and it is fully reliant on surveys. We call them a Heidi How. We call it a how'd you hear about us? And it is one of the most basic ways, particularly for brands that are able to convert traffic online. There's really no reason not to have a how'd you hear about us survey. They are the lifeblood of this industry, and they should be for all advertisers used in a redundant way to anything else that you can do. If you can do a tracking pixel, do it, but you still need that survey data to give you a 360-degree view of what percentage of your customers are coming through what marketing channels. So I was talking about the case study. What we did a few years ago, I was actually helping a client as an interim chief marketing officer. And maybe the biggest initiative I was able to bring forward for them was not just to have a how'd you hear about us survey, but to add a second layer to that survey. And that second layer means that if I see a drop-down menu that says, where did you hear about us in the conversion funnel? And the user chooses something that is fragmented like podcasting or radio, or it could be a number of channels. But then there are the sub-channels, and you don't want to just know how the channel worked. You want to know how the specific program that you bought worked. Well, rather than having them go to a vanity URL where you might see 4% of total respondents actually doing it, and you never get to statistical significance, if you can actually click the channel and say podcast, for example, and then have a second question that asks you, what show did you hear this on? Using predictive text, the user now can do any combination of permutations of spelling, of picking a keyword from the show, of picking the name of the talent, and using predictive text that can be auto suggested to them so they can grab it. It removes a ton of friction in the process. Now, why am I talking about all this? Because that second layer survey was a real revelation for us. We saw a more than 700% increase in the visibility of how every show performed. And when you're an advertiser putting your company's hard-earned dollars into a marketing program, you need clarity, you need visibility, and you need to know how things are working on a show-by-show basis. That's why we work with Fairing. Fairing is a company that is our go-to solution for doing attribution with surveys. They have a very easy way to implement them on your site. It only takes a few minutes to set up and allows you to optimize, to randomize the survey possibilities and give you more reliable data. And then it allows you to create that second layer survey. And when you have the second layer survey, you can kill the vanity URL. If you want to read our case study about it, go to oxfordroad.com and go to our thought leadership page, and you can download the free white paper that is called Solving the Audio Attribution Problem, Bonfire of the Vanity URLs. That's based on things that you can do with Fairing, and we believe Fairing is the leader in providing this type of solution. They are today's sponsor, but they're not just a sponsor. I would tell you this 365 days of the year. If you're not using a survey, and you can, and you're not using a second layer on that survey, and you are flying blind, and you don't have to. You can give up on some of these antiquated methodologies that are actually probably creating more confusion than they're eliminating. Fairing is the answer to be able to prove the return on ad spend that you're getting and do a lot less guesswork. Fairing works alongside your existing promo codes and pixels. You don't have to stop using those, but it is a better way to get to the clarity on who's responding from what channels faster. You can actually install their script today to see what your audio campaigns have been delivering. Just go to fairing.co, Fairing.co, fairing.co. Use their promo code Oxford30 to get started. And with that code, you'll get a 14-day trial extended to a brand new 30-day trial, courtesy of the Media Roundtable. Use that promo code Oxford30 to extend their 14-day trial to a 30-day trial. That's at fairing.co. And please, for heaven's sakes, for your own sake, for the sake of the success of your marketing campaigns, start using a survey and start using a second layer survey to get precise information about how every individual show you're sponsoring is performing. So let's get to it, shall we? What I'm thinking is maybe we each read the definitions that we've come up with so far, and then we start talking through the key differences, see if we can make some decisions here. If you're ready, I'll give you first crack.
Sure. So what we have proposed as a definition based on the research we've done is podcasting, colon, and we really tried to consider every word very carefully. Podcasting, audio-driven spoken word media delivered on demand and at times supplemented by video. Podcasts feature a variety of themes and formats with descriptive storytelling and vivid conversations and are usually made available freely. As I said, we tried to consider every word and make it as efficient as possible, but cover all ground. My group here, and I worked very closely with two people I did want to shout out, Megan Lazovic and Alex Barjaki on this, especially that first sentence, audio driven, spoken word media, delivered on demand, and at times supplemented by video. That could be sufficient, but then we felt it could go farther, and we added the second sentence that I also read.
Perfect. And then I'll read the one we came up with, which is an audio-driven, on-demand form of digital media, commonly decentralized via RSS, featuring episodic content across diverse themes and formats, emphasizing creator freedom and community engagement, and often supplemented by video. And I'm going to just add a couple other pieces of this. Now, nobody's going to memorize that. Well, maybe four of us will. But we're also going to need a shorthand. And I would say if you can see it with your eyes closed, it's a podcast. And then here's the second piece I think is really important. In I think both of our definitions, we believe that this is an audio driven medium. But what do you do if like when is video necessary? Like what a lot of people have said is it has to work when you're not watching it for it to be a podcast. And I think that's maybe a fair definition, but it's limiting when you have like I'll just use Hot Ones as an example, where the video piece really is material, even though you can distribute it any way you want as audio only. Something is lost if you don't have the visual. In many cases, something is gained by not having the visual because you tap in a theater of the mind, but in some cases, it's not. How do you accommodate that? And what's the difference between this and every other YouTuber? And I would say if you need to see it, it is a video podcast, and a video podcast is an audio visual on demand form of digital media, often decentralized via RSS or platforms, featuring episodic content across diverse themes and formats, emphasizing creator freedom, audience engagement, and visual communication. So, in my view, it's all podcast. And if you need the video for it to make sense, it's a video podcast, and I don't care if you wanna shorthand it by calling it a vodcast, a vidcast, a vlog, all these nicknames. Whatever you want, it's still a podcast because podcasting is here to stay, and we gotta make room for video. So
The example I use, by the way, with regard to that, you might want to use this one, is when I lived in Philadelphia many, many years ago. There was this quirky thing in any city that had an over-the-air channel 6 on their television. The audio chain of channel 6s anywhere in America was available at the bottom end of the FM dial. And so you could actually listen to channel 6 Philadelphia. And I did regularly when I was living there. When television digitized, this went away. There were 2 shows in a row on channel 6, like on so many television stations all over America, was Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy! And I will tell you that Jeopardy works great as a radio show. Jeopardy, in fact, if they're listening to our discussion, they should make a daily podcast of the audio chain of Jeopardy. Sometimes they have video daily doubles, but short of that, it works perfectly well as a radio show. Wheel of Fortune is useless as a radio show. You need to see that board in order to play the game. So I think that essentially defines what you're talking about, which is Jeopardy could be a podcast. Wheel of Fortune simply could not.
I love that, and at some point, I think they'll get on the bandwagon here along with everybody else. Okay, so let's start running through these differences, because this is the hard part. So, had our friend ChatGPT chop up the key differences between what you presented and what I presented, and we're going to talk about those differences here. So, the first thing is the core concept and structure. The big difference is definition one, which is the one you presented, uses spoken word media. This suggests a focus on verbal audio content, reinforcing that podcasts are primarily speech driven rather than music or other types of content. Now, in the second definition, this is broader, acknowledging that podcasts exist within a larger media ecosystem and may include text, visuals, and video. The thing that chat didn't pick up on this is the other reason we use digital media and didn't say spoken word is I think there are a lot of shows that rely on sounds, things that help you sleep, ASMR, there could be animal noises, right? Like there's a lot of different ways you can go with it. And I'm for a broad definition. That being said, like I've worked in spoken word media all my life, and I think it's part and parcel. And truly, I debated this with some folks deeply before landing here, but I think there's great arguments on both sides.
Yeah, I personally think yours is just a little too overbroad. Acknowledging those sort of edge cases, like, well, first of all, we could get into it on whether a straight just ASMR stream of content would be a podcast. But pushing that aside, your definition is, in my opinion, a little overbroad because it's hard to see how a song wouldn't qualify. And if there was any point of consensus, certainly in the consumer interviews, but I would think in any kind of broader discussion, with industry experts, et cetera, is listening to the latest Taylor Swift album is not a podcast. If you're listening to that content not on a vinyl record, but as digital files, it would qualify under the broader definition. I really think it has to be scoped down So acknowledging these sort of edge cases, I really feel like spoken word is the essence, really, for at least at the consumer level, of what defines a podcast.
So, what would your thesis advisor say about audio driven and spoken word being both in the definition? Is that redundant?
No, because close to the edge, I would say, of redundancy, but I do think there's a slightly different point here, uh, because the spoken word simply is referring to the kind of content, whereas audio driven implies the point that we've been making about with your eyes closed, you would still be able to understand most of the content. And so I do think both those parts are needed to accurately define it. Dan's making a comment about, I made a comment earlier about my thesis advisor being ruthless with regard to having as few words as possible to say what you're trying to say. But in this case, I think he would let the combination of two compound adjectives go, because audio driven and spoken word, that's a lot. I will acknowledge it, but I think he would let it go. He's been dead for many, many years, so sadly we cannot
We're just
consult
going
with
to
him.
have to interpret. We don't get to know every perspective here. We just
Yes,
have to assume. But
he
sounds
was
like you had
old
a great
old
advisor.
back then.
Yeah. Okay. So debating this out a little further, I'll give you a practical challenge, which is that you got a lot of money moving into this space, right? We know that talent agencies are chomping at the bit. They're licking their chops and they're going, we're taking this thing over. There's a lot of resistance, and a lot of people, a lot of the folks in that camp, I think, are trying to move off of podcasts even being something that should be defined, or a word that we even need to use. If you hit them up front and double down with a 1-2 punch of audio driven and spoken word media, you may inadvertently split the market. Because one of the things, it's so funny, is I've had all these conversations and I've had people concerned talking to me that they think you're just pushing for audio only, thinking that, we're going in a direction that removes video from the conversation or the definition. I want the point to be made, and I think it's important, and I think we both agree that this thing does start with the spoken word. It really does. But that isn't mutually exclusive with a video. For like, this conversation is driven by the conversation, but we have a video, right? And that's what I think maintains the purity of what makes it a podcast. Now, you double down on that. I don't know if anybody's going to read all the way to the end. I think they're going to read that as an attack on the video landscape. And I think because there's a lot of sensitivity here, I'm feeling it. I might.
Maybe. I mean, a few words later, we say at times supplemented by video. So we're certainly not trying to be antagonistic towards the video first or
Oh,
the
no, we're
sort.
definitely not trying to, but the conversation feels antagonistic to some, and I'm just saying,
Mm,
I think that there are, for brevity, for clarity, and to not provide the appearance of exclusion for our video native friends, I think we may want to pick one term at the beginning, and I would bring it back to saying, I think spoken word media defines it as such, and that makes it sound like it's only spoken word, whereas we have the word driven strategically placed. I could potentially acknowledge that spoken word driven versus audio driven has enough inherent benefits to do that, but I don't think we need the 1-2 punch up front.
yeah, we could go with that. Spoken word driven media and delivered on demand. And at some point, then later on, you need to say that can be consumed in an audio only environment, but is sometimes supplemented with video or words to that effect.
So this is interesting. You made a point when we were not recording. There's going to be three people that find this conversation interesting now. I think the bigger macro stuff, but now we're in the nitty gritty. So let's just stay here in the dirt and the mud. We'll find out who's serious about this business based on the feedback we get. You said offline digital media was redundant because the fact that you've got on demand implies that it is digital. And I think that's a reasonable argument. I accept that argument. I do think calling it a form of media, and I'm going to get back to the previous point because I don't think we settled it. But I think that there's also a good argument that calling it a form of, is that redundant when you say that it's media? Because I think that here's the case I would make. Form of tells you that it's in the lexicon. It's got its own name versus if it's just media, it could fall in another lane. So I'm going to advocate that it stays as a form of media, albeit not a digital form of media because the on demand piece already made that known.
We can go with that. Spoken word driven digital media delivered on demand. I still think you don't need it, but it sounds like the word digital matters here. And
No,
by the
no, no,
way,
no, no, no. I'm not arguing for digital. I'm
oh,
arguing for form of. I
oh,
accept
I
your
see.
argument that digital
Spoken
is
word
not
driven
necessary.
form of media delivered on demand. I don't think you need form of, but my thesis advisor absolutely would strike out form of, but it seems to make you more comfortable. So I can
Well,
go either way.
that's not important. I think what's important is the meaning. And help me get this meaning in that I think we both agree on. I think we both agree that we're classifying a media channel, a type of media. And I think if we only say that it is media, I don't think that implies classification. So, how do we make sure that the classification is made known through this definition?
Yes, you and I just disagree. I think the attaching on demand to it creates that clear implication. So I think we have the definition of podcasting in like 6 words here. Spoken word digital media delivered on demand. You could stop right there and say that is podcasting. The spoken word count as one driven media delivered on demand. That's 5 words if you count those compound words as one. So then we've dropped the audio driven, so you don't need the sometimes supplemented by video. If you want to be ruthlessly efficient here, you can get down to 5 words, and then everything else is just color commentary.
Give me your case one last time, and I'm going to tell you if I can buy it or not on spoken word versus audio. I hear you that ASMR is a rounding error.
Yes, if you just say audio delivered on demand, that can be music. That could be really, you know, well, especially music. Audio delivered on demand absolutely incorporates music, and we have to sector that out, notwithstanding the ASMR discussion or podcasts that play music or talk about music.
Okay, so a spoken word driven, we both agree with driven. On demand, we agree with on demand. Then you say it's just media. I say form of because I think it's important that it's clear that this is we are classifying, but you're saying that's implicit.
Yes.
And why is it implicit?
I just don't see I see no distinction between media and form of media.
You're saying because once you've said it's audio driven spoken
No,
word,
you
or
don't even need audio driven.
once you've said spoken word driven on
Mm,
demand media, now you've implied that
a
it the
form of media.
classification. You think it's already a channel. Okay,
Yes.
I think I can accept that. I think I can accept that. I'm still chewing on spoken word versus audio, but I think you've got strong arguments for it. So I'm going to park that. We've now had the digital spoken word discussion. The next piece is the role of RSS and decentralization. Definition 1 doesn't talk about RSS. Definition 2 specifically states that commonly decentralized via RSS. Commonly, key word there. Your case.
As I mentioned earlier, the consumers don't really mention any of that when you ask them about the definition. They will absolutely talk about a world with endless choices, infinite choices. They will talk about, I suppose, on some level, their ability to search and find those choices. No one outside of the industry is defining it around the sort of delivery mechanism, or the sort of technical underpinnings of the medium. So I didn't feel that a mention of RSS mattered. I think the consumers see it as decentralized. So to the consumer, that's a distinction that maybe industry people are concerned with, but consumers see a world of every possible thing under the sun.
Let me give you some counterpoints on that. One, I think for a definition, the industry application is more important than the consumer application. The consumers will see it on a platform, they'll push the button, they'll get the content that they want. But for the industry, I think about this as less about for the Oxford Dictionary and more for, the IAB and the ANA and, how people that work in the business are going to be using it. So with that in mind as an intended use case, do you still believe that it's not important to delineate the decentralized piece?
I think decentralization in and of itself is not important. I think underscoring at some level the roots of the industry being without gatekeepers and sort of available for anyone with a microphone, if you will, to create, I do think should be at least referenced on some level.
So, if it's not decentralized, how do you keep it open? And how do you maintain we kind of talked at the beginning of the show about, that being one of the key characteristics that has allowed the platform to be different and to flourish.
See, I think this is where you and I have a slight disagreement.
Okay.
When Rogan and Call Her Daddy were exclusively available on Spotify, I don't think that means that the industry was decentralized. The fact that some of the content is not available to everyone doesn't in and of itself mean that the industry has become centralized. Those two shows maybe have become centralized, but the freedom of anyone to start their own podcast and get it up available to anyone who wants to download it remained and remains today. So I don't see any sort of at least current, there's no concern from the consumer about restrictions or centralization. Um,
Well,
so
but to the
it's just not part
industry,
of the definition.
but if this is an industry definition, then that
Even
argument
then, I
doesn't
don't think,
hold.
let's say we were talking to advertisers. For us to say some shows are sold exclusively in this manner or another manner doesn't mean that we can't represent podcasting anymore. And most people are walking into advertisers representing a list of shows or certain shows, not podcasting writ large. Most people can't sell ads on every possible podcast under the sun. So I again, this seems to be the area where you and I have the clearest lack of consensus between ourselves in terms of its importance to the definition.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I look at it from two ways. Just thinking about the long-term health of the product, right? What consumers are consuming, whether or not they're thinking about these issues. I think one of my challenges is if you strip away decentralized, we're acknowledging there's a duopoly now, and that duopoly can choose what's available on their platforms anytime they want, and the creator is always at the mercy of who gets in and how their content is accessible. Have you ever gone on YouTube and tried to find a podcast and you just couldn't find it using very clear search terms, including the name, for example? 'Cause
No, I
I've had
personally,
that
I
I
okay.
have. Yeah, I mean, listen, look up our last interview, see how easy it is to find.
Oh,
It's
episodes, yes. Episodes, yes. The show,
it's not a
no.
straightforward Google does not have a straightforward search engine within their
Yes.
video platform. There are algorithms changing things all the time. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not saying they're not podcasts. I'm not saying we shouldn't have 80% of the market consuming through there. However, let's acknowledge that there is a trade being made. And the problem isn't video. The problem is you have limited control over how accessible your content is because somebody can flip a switch anytime and make it harder to find you. And if you're a producer, a creator trying to get your voice out into the market, and you're now forced into the whims of two companies, I think you start to lose fundamentally what this was about, which is independent voices available to all, and you're instead now catering to what do we think is going to be rewarded by these corporations. And I think that takes the industry in a very subtle but over time very meaningful direction that I don't want it to go. That's more from the perspective of the consumer. I'm going to restate one more point on the money side of this question. RSS allows third party verification of show consumption, audiences, information about those audiences, information about ads that ran, transcripts of those ads. I understand that those are accessible through platforms today, but you always have that ability to audit. The most important piece is that the attribution is going away and getting fragmented. When there is no RSS, there is no standardized way to know how many people were reached by a podcast and how many people responded to the ad. And I will tell you, if I had a pie chart of the time spent in conversation with advertisers over the years on different topics, the largest slice of that pie is attribution. Hands down, no question. More than creative, more than media placement strategy, more than frequency, it is attribution all day long that the brands care about. You take that off the table, which has been done, and you say, well, on this channel, you have to click a link in the show description. You're fragmenting and you're not giving as much precision to the brand. So for me, the decentralization is actually critical to maintain the spirit of the industry. And I'm not saying it has to be RSS. Like you said earlier, somebody else could come along and provide it. I'm not an RSS purist, and I'm going to keep working in this business no matter which way it falls. But I think it's to the advantage of the industry to tip our hat and say, this is commonly decentralized, and RSS happens to be the foremost use case of that. Now, I don't know if I'm jamming that into an industry definition, but I actually believe that the essence and the future of even having an industry to call podcasting largely rests on this topic.
I find your use of that in the definition just a little too specific and a little too narrow. And that's why I, on my team, went with freely available to all, as opposed to being quite so specific around RSS and specific platforms.
So freely available to all, was that would is
Well,
that
and even freely, I'm now wondering about because there's the implication of not paying, and there are cases where people absolutely pay for podcasts. So I need probably to find a synonym for freely that doesn't have the implication of no cost.
yeah, and I think that's one of the things
It's
that's been challenging in
openly
this.
available
Yeah.
or something.
That's been one of the key challenges in this project, frankly, for me, is to say, how do we make sure that the spirit of what brought us here stays in the picture, the part that doesn't need to change? We can't change as the consumption migrates between platforms. It's not on an iPod. We're in a different world. There's video now. Great. That idea of openness, the idea that everyone can have a voice, so important. Now, you've said that usually freely available. And yeah, I think you could look at that as a money thing. Does it cost to consume? I don't know that your definition does that, but I still think that centralized versus decentralized, I don't know that that's solved for by saying made freely available, because you could say today, well, it's freely available on YouTube. It doesn't
Right.
mean it's not it doesn't mean it's decentralized.
And I acknowledge your concerns, but I don't share your belief that it's central to the definition of podcasting.
Is there anything else that I've said that you think is worth including in the definition in some form, even if we can't figure out the more elegant way to say it here?
Pretty much everything else we have overlaps pretty neatly. You mentioned things like creator freedom, which again, I'm sort of handling in a much broader sense with this freely available. We probably could add some more to our definition to talk about how anyone with a microphone can create and make available. Um, so the rest of it tends to overlap quite a bit, even if the sort of sequence of words is a little bit different at times.
Well, then let's look at the next one, which is, should the definition specify storytelling and conversation as key elements, or should it remain open to non-traditional formats? So in the second definition, it said featuring episodic content across diverse themes and formats versus with descriptive storytelling and vivid conversations.
Right. Ours is really taken straight from the mouths of the people we interviewed. The words like storytelling and conversation. That is how we got those by synthesizing what people told us. Often use the word interviews as well, which we felt conversations covered. So we didn't feel we had to specifically get the word interviews in there. But when you ask people what is the content in general, they use words conversations and interviews as one example and storytelling as the other. So that's why we focused in on those.
So I hear why you did that from the consumer's point of view, but as we think about a working industry definition, I guess where I'm coming down on this is I like storytelling. I chewed on both of these words for a long time. I wanted the word conversation, and we had somebody come on the show, actually from our team, who said that it's conversation, even if it's just conversation between the host and the audience, right?
Yes, and we heard
And
that from the consumers as well. You didn't need 2 people or more to be a conversation. We absolutely heard that from respondents.
so that's interesting, and I like that. I also like storytelling because it's art, it's beauty, it's what everybody wants in entertainment. I think where this falls down for me is that, I'm going for the broad landscape that makes room for different genres. Now, I think if it's a real fringe thing, then it's okay to not worry about all edge cases. But I do think that things that are more instructive or technical are not necessarily vivid conversations or storytelling. And so much of the industry is teaching, and they're not necessarily following any type of story structure whatsoever. So I just felt that I like these words. I think they have value, and I think that consumers are the majority of the time going to identify with this as part of what they love about the medium. I also had the same problem with intimate, right? Which was, I'm like, well, intimacy is like one of the key ingredients here, but it's not necessarily a key ingredient. And so I left it out of the definition.
Agreed. Plus, it's a bit can be loaded at times and misinterpreted at times. So I think it's the right call to leave that out, even though you and I both agree it's central to so much of podcasting. Very similarly, I mean, a key point is you use the word diverse. We use the word variety. That came up endlessly in the consumer part of the research as central to what's going on here. Diverse has also taken on shades of meaning that at times can be misinterpreted, and that's why we went with variety. But the fancier words like multiplicity or whatever, that was overwhelmingly agreed to as a sort of central part of what we're talking about here is a world with just endless amounts of potential things to consume.
So, key difference on storytelling and conversations. Do you stand behind that, or would you agree that there's an opportunity for a broader implication here?
You could, I suppose, add to what we've put in that part of the definition, often with or including descriptive storytelling and vivid conversations to cover some of those, as you put it, cases that maybe don't fit neatly into either.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay, so we're aligned on that. And then a few other key differences here: creator freedom and community engagement. And I think what you're saying is the people you spoke to didn't really think about that at all. That was
Correct.
not okay. And I think that we're getting back to the core of the medium and like, why is this not a song? Why is this not, how is this different than any other video you can get on, TikTok or wherever, right? I think the podcast election is illustrative of the power of this medium to really reach communities of people, and that can be used for purposes that we like and purposes that we don't like, but it is part of its power to tap in. And I acknowledge there may be a better way to communicate that, but I don't know that we've gotten there yet. And I think it's an important part of the definition to share that, this is something that activates people in a little bit of a different way. Your response to that?
I agree with everything you just said. I think we're aligned on that.
Well, so how do you do it?
With regard to this definition,
Yes.
I just don't see community. I acknowledge everything you said, but I don't think that community engagement is definitional here. Um, you can just be putting content out there that people find informative, perhaps, or useful, but not necessarily something that leads to that sort of broader community engagement. And that just seemed sort of beyond the scope of what consumers defined as podcasting. I don't for a minute discount the incredible stories of how, you hear of these podcasters, often with, relatively small podcasts, but they have the ability to take their shows on the road and sell tickets to live tapings. And it's just, they're amazing stories to show the power of the medium. But I just didn't think that was definitional to the medium.
What about creator freedom?
Well, we've talked about this a number of times. I think we're both very aligned that that is a key, has been at least a key part of the definition. We both hope it continues being a key part of the definition. And I am open to expanding our definition to, I need to find the right way to word it, but to include that sort of any person with a microphone can freely access.
Okay, so if it was emphasizing creator freedom and we cut and community engagement, you feel that that would be more appropriate.
Yes.
Okay. All right. That might be a reasonable change based on the arguments here. Okay. Video as supplement. You said at times. I said often. And, again, here we go. I think most of it is moving to video. And so I think at times may not do it justice. We may get a lot of fair pushback on that.
Yeah, I have no way of knowing what percentage of podcasts are also available in a video format. I would think it's still a small minority, to be honest with you. I don't know that number. So,
Well, I think the point is in your research, you had 60% of the audience saying that YouTube videos are podcasts, right?
yes,
And so I think as the definition is expanding and encompassing video, now all of a sudden it's, nobody can really tabulate this thing right now. But I think just knowing where the puck is moving. uh,
consumers absolutely accept podcasts that are available on YouTube as podcasts.
right.
Whereas
And
not that
so,
many years ago, there would be industry people
mhm.
arguing that they were not podcasts.
So I'm motioning for often. Any pushback on that versus at times because
I don't I
because
don't feel
often
strongly about
allows for
that.
that without making it a majority. Okay.
Yep. I don't feel strongly about that at all.
Okay. Free versus paid, usually made freely available versus definition two, no mention of price or
Yeah.
accessibility. I think we pretty
I
much
want to
covered
change that
that.
word freely to something like openly or easily or something.
Open is an interesting word.
Yeah.
Here's what I'm getting out of this. I'm
The
still
main thing you should be getting is that our definition was vastly better than yours.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. It definitely reads cleaner, but it may not serve the industry
And I'm
quite as
teasing.
well. No, of course. We're geeking out here, but I think the reason is because it's important, and I know this is a lot to listen to. This is not the most entertaining podcast that's ever been recorded, at least this stage of it. But this stuff really matters, and I think So kind of here's where I'm getting our key differences that you've called out are spoken word versus audio, RSS versus not mentioning distribution, variety versus diversity. And that's because we're starting to see actual market limitations now. That was everybody's word, and now all of a sudden everyone's fleeing from that word. I don't even want that to factor into this calculation, but maybe it should.
There's a perfectly good word of variety. And if diversity has taken on layers to it that concern anyone who's reading this, you might as well just default to the straightforward variety.
Yeah, I think to avoid distraction and keep it focused, we probably don't need the definition being a political football. This thing's it's going to be controversial enough. So let me tell you what I've got. We've come to agreement on a lot of this. The biggest difference where I think we're not necessarily eye to eye is around this RSS and decentralized piece, but I'm going to keep fighting for it till we come up with something else. If we come up with something else, and I would say here's where we're landing. A podcast is a spoken word driven, on demand form of media, commonly decentralized via RSS, featuring episodic content across a variety of themes and formats, emphasizing creator freedom and often supplemented by video. I think that's where we're landing here. You got any final thoughts?
No, but I think we should ask the listeners to the Media Roundtable to reach out to us as well, probably.
Yeah, they're not going to hear this before we publish, so
All
they're
right.
gonna,
Take
they're
that
going to
out,
have to
Ruby.
tell us why we're idiots after the fact. I think we may have a definition here. I don't want to say that when you read the white paper there won't be a word or two that moves, but Larry, I think we've done some good work here. I think we've definitely put our brains through the ringer, but this is important stuff.
It's sometimes interesting to go inside the innards of things. So hopefully some listeners out there have enjoyed listening to us hash these things out word by word, concept by concept, and at least appreciate how hard doing something like this can be. There's no singular word that you could just attach to it like in Webster's dictionary or something like that. So it's a hard process, but I think we are close to a one that people can discuss themselves, but hopefully agree on.
Larry, one last loose end, and then we'll do some closing reflections here. Episodic, we didn't talk about.
Yeah, the consumers did use the word consistent and things like that. They, do have a sense for shows that publish regularly. I didn't think it needed to be in the definition. I think it sort of was implied. There are cases, I suppose, where you could have just a single show that episodic most people I think are going to interpret episodic as thinking that item one leads directly to item two, and like a television show, television series. And so
So
I
you're
didn't
saying
feel that word
Jeopardy
was
is
central.
not episodic?
Well, there's episodes, but it's not episodic. And yeah, that might sound like a really thin definition, but I do think there's a difference.
Well, I think we have to accommodate it. I agree with you. It doesn't have to, each one doesn't have to flow into the next, but I do think it needs to be a series, right? Well, and maybe that's what it is.
I mean, in theory, you could do a single standalone podcast. It still would fit the definition of a podcast.
Well, so I've asked people that question. A lot of the feedback I got was no, if it's only one, then it's probably a book or it's something else or it's a post. But a podcast is generally something that you can go back to as part of that community. Even Dan Carlin releases multiple episodes, no matter how long it takes, right? And so I think it's an important distinction. Do you think it solves it if we use the word series? Maybe that's
Um,
commonly as a series.
yeah, you would
Maybe
have to
that
do
is
one of those disclaimers on top of that as well.
okay, Larry, this has been fantastic, and I think we're at the 1 yard line. There may be changes, and so we're going to end with a cliffhanger. But I think this is fantastic, and you and your team have been wonderful partners in what I hope is a meaningful turning point in the industry where we start to define ourselves and make it a little easier for people to consume and do business in the space that we care about. Closing reflections from you.
Well, all credit to you and your team for coming up with this idea and forcing this intellectual exercise. And, sometimes you're so busy in the day to day of running your business and doing your business that you kind of don't take the time to step back and say, what exactly are we doing here? And what is the definition of what we're involved with here? So, like I said, all credit to you guys. It's been such an interesting project to really think hard about what is the definition? What do consumers think it is? What do people in the industry think it is, and what maybe could we all agree it is?
Amen. Well, thank you, Larry. We'll see you next time on the Media Roundtable and let the conversation continue.
Thanks so much.
That was another conversation from our full series, What's a Podcast? And whether you're a podcaster, an advertiser, or somebody who just cares about this space, I hope this stretched you. It's certainly stretched me and is giving us a lot to think about in how we want to live going forward and protect and preserve the essence of the medium while preparing for the changes we need to make to evolve on the road ahead. If you want to hear the full limited 3-part docu-series, What's a Podcast? The Revolution Redefined. Check it out wherever you listen to your shows. But if you want to go beyond that and you want to be a part of the movement that we've got here, it's not just about our defining it. It's about figuring out a path forward. Go to our link in the show description and download our free white paper, What is a Podcast? That has research from over 4,000 Americans on what consumers believe that the industry is. And make sure you sign our petition, also available in the link in the show description, to keep podcasting open. You know, this show is not just about content, learning, or entertainment. This is about having a real effect in the real world on issues that are important to all of us. We hope you'll continue to be a part of it and bring this into real life. Go to oxfordroad.com for more resources or click the links in the show description. Thanks for your time.